what the plant is telling us, and how do we perform analyses and collect data to confirm what our eyes are telling us. A lot of times we make decisions on the farm with gut instinct and some marginally good data that perhaps we Googled once. What I'd like to challenge you guys today with is either collecting your own data or having somebody collect that data so that you can really do a good checkup. Wellness and health is something that all of us, it's our most valuable resource for us in our human bodies, but that's also true in the vineyard. And so one of the techniques that we do to monitor vineyard health is actually to do these types of assessments in the field. So we're going to talk a little bit about what leaves to do, what the actual field procedures look like, some lookouts, some different techniques and different data analyses that you may be experiencing or exposed to already with the horticulturist or viticulturist that you trust to give you that information. And maybe we can take home some ideas that will help us challenge what we previously thought about what our plants have been telling us. So I'm Christie Apple. I'm an agriculture veteran. I grew up in a farming family down in central Michigan where we predominantly farm row crop. However, about 15 years ago, I got the bug to get into the ag industry. My background previously was business, and I realized that my passion for physiology and biology was actually perfectly deltaed in the agronomy space. And so I went upon a journey to become an agronomist. And over the last 5 or so years, I've dove hard into the specialty crop realm because there's like 1 million corn and soybean agronomists out there doing excellent work. There's not a lot of people supporting folks like you, specialty crop producers with very unique needs, very, very thin margins, and very small windows of error to maximize your yields. And so sometimes when we're producing other products with what we're creating in the field, we forget that it isn't always about the tons or the bushels. A lot of times it's about the bricks and the TA and the pH, right? That's what we're trying to create here, right? Fruit that has a quality that we can do something with and eventually sell. So that's where I've been for the last several years. I specialize in soil health. My approach to viticulture is through the lens of soil health. Healthier soils produce healthier plants, produce stronger yields, produce more resilient cropping systems that will last longer. They also respond to treatments that are oriented to soil health much better than they do with our traditional synthetic commercial fertility and pest management tools. So when we can start to put our minds in the head of the plant, how am I feeling, listening to our bodies, then we can actually respond better proactively instead of reactively, which not only saves us money, but it also saves the greater impact of unwanted side effects from our traditional medicines that we use to treat our fields. I realize there's some things we can't get away from. There's certain things that we will always need to do to make our systems work. You may be farming on sand here, or you may be farming on clay somewhere else, or you may be farming on gravel somewhere else. My particular farm, where we row crop farm, my husband and I, we should be farming sand and 2A gravel. We haven't given in. We've decided to go the cover crop route and try a regenerative system for a few years and give that a chance because our soils are in tough condition, but we think we can do it and we're on our way. So what I'm doing here with you folks is going to talk to you a little bit about how to understand what the plant is feeling and how to become its patient advocate. If that terminology makes sense to you, it'd be like taking your elderly parent to the doctor and answering questions or asking questions so that the patient can understand and interpreting it in your mom's language to the doctor, right? You're going to help make decisions with the information that we can collectively share. Who here is currently using some type of nutrient analysis in season during the growing season? Raise a hand. Are you tissue sampling, sap analysis? Watch that hand, Tom. Watch that hand, Tom. Oh. Okay, my question is, why are you doing that? Somebody that raised their hand, what inspired you to start with tissue analysis in your vineyard? Would anybody like to share?
It's just what you said, in order to see an inside view of what's going on.
How long have you been doing that practice?
I haven't. That's why.
You want to, though.
This is the year.
Okay. All right.
Try to break the code.
Very good. Very good. For somebody that's been doing it a while, what are some things that you've learned, or how's that impacted your practices over the years on tissue analysis? Somebody raise their hand back here. Who's doing it? Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So again, I'm going to use the human health and wellness metaphor here to help us kind of grasp this concept. But say, for example, you're exhibiting symptoms of high blood pressure and the doctor prescribes to you something that's supposed to reduce your blood pressure. There needs to be a series of baseline data collected to understand if that's the right tool in the first place, right? So you're going to want to collect some baseline data. So for our vineyard, for example, do you have a soil sample that could provide us with some baseline information of what our soil textures look like and maybe our soil content, right? What's physically there that we can build a program on? What are your practices, right? The doctor always asks you, how much do you exercise? Those kinds of questions, right? Same kind of concept applies here. What are your cultural practices? What is your pruning techniques or your pruning method, your trellising methods? Because those will affect nutrient dispersion throughout the plant, right? If you have a single fruiting zone or a double fruiting zone, you're partitioning nutrients into different parts of the plant, and those things have an impact. So understanding that each of those cultural practices does carry an impact on whether or not that's the right tool. So say the doctor writes a prescription, we're going to do a triple 19 and you're going to spread it whenever, and this is what the plan is. So you go about following through. Now, how do we know if that actually worked? How do we know if that had the effect we wanted? Maybe we got some vegetative growth out of it, but our plant is still looking yellow, or we're starting to show some other type of nutrient deficiency symptoms. There's some side effect there that wasn't quite the right fit. So how do we do that? We go out into our vineyard. There's two really critical windows of tissue analysis. One is right at bloom. Immediately when that cultivar starts to bloom, you want to go and get some tissue analysis. I'd like for you to bear in mind that what leaf you pick matters. Okay, very much so. Because an immature leaf, equate that to, like, say, a teenager. They're not mature enough to do what an adult could do, but they're not a baby. So the nutritional needs are very different. And it's a sink, right? You could take a teenager through a drive-through and spend $50 and they're still not full. But when you have a mature leaf, it's much more balanced. It's fully developed. It doesn't have these dramatic nutritional needs. So we treat those things different. It tells us something different. So we want to be cognizant of what leaf we're sampling when we're out in the field. Another thing I'd like to demonstrate for you here. Although we do find that most folks that attend these types of meetings understand what I'm talking about when I say a leaf blade, right? This being a leaf, this being a petiole. These are different organs with very different function for the vine and for the fruit. This has a dual purpose. It's both a solar panel and a storage unit. This is a transportation rig. Okay, these tell us two very different things. When we do tissue analysis, some folks are of the mindset that all you need is a leaf blade. That's true, you can do that. We've been doing that for many, many years. That's one way to understand how our solar panels are doing. Some people prefer a petiole sample. That will tell us how our straws are doing. But when we combine these two, what we're doing is looking at a system instead of two segregated parts. So when we tissue sample, what we'll do is we'll pull a whole leaf. This is considered a whole leaf sample. So the things that the lab is going to do is an analysis. They'll digest the nutrients available in this, and that will give us a baseline of what's out there. One of the practices that I personally have found very, very helpful when I'm tissue sampling is to sample both the leaf from multiple plants, somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to 90 plants in that block. Treat each cultivar as if its own little farm. So we would have a Pinot Noir block. We will have a Cab Franc block, right? Or we'll have multiple Cab Franc blocks. Treat them like their own little babies, their own little farms, because they respond phenologically different to stimulus, such as weather, soil texture, nutrient demand, that type of thing. As we all know, everybody has those grapes that act a bit naughty during certain times of the season, more so than others, right? So we want to treat them differently so that we're not combining multiple cultivars and then scattering our data across the floor is basically what that's doing. So I want you to treat each cultivar as its own little farm when you're submitting samples. Another trick or hack, I guess you could say, that I found to be very, very helpful is to sample leaves from a plant that is on both a fruiting branch, and also if you haven't pruned already or pulled, you can grab leaves off of a branch that doesn't have a cluster on it. If you still have clusters, we're getting to the point where we're going to be thinning here and those will be gone. But earlier in the season, you could do both. That will give you some different information about how each of our placements are doing, nutritionally speaking. So another thing that I'll share with you, since we're on camera today, I can't take you out there so that we don't lose these folks at home, but I do want to show you when you're out in your vineyard, if you are doing your own tissue analysis, there's something you should know. Remember I talked about the teenager and the adult leaves? What I'd like for you to do is just think about it like this. 5 to 7 leaves from your most mature leaf. So we're going to call this new guy at the tip, start at the tip of your shoot. He's not mature enough yet. He's a teenager. He's incorrigible. He knows everything. He's a sink. He's not helpful to our nutrient plan. So I'm going to call him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll say 6. And I take a look at that leaf and make sure that it's, first of all, clean. It doesn't have any presence of disease. It doesn't have any residue from my most recent mancozeb application, particularly zinc and MN residues from specific fungicides can cause our tissue analysis to become skewed. So make sure that that leaf is clean. If it isn't clean, disregard that shoot and move on to one that you can find is clean. Please stage these tissue analysis away from your applications as much as possible. I realize that can become complicated if you're chasing a specific disease in the vineyard, but you want to take that, somewhere between 5 and 7. Those are generally nice and mature. I use my fingers, my fingernails. No special tools are necessary. Just pop it off right there, your whole blade. Get 85 or so of these, put it in a paper sack. Make sure there's no dirt residue on it. Put it in that paper sack. We'll label it for that block. We'll ship it to the lab. About 3 to 4 days, you're going to get a really good analysis of what that whole system, both your supply straw and your solar panel, is telling you together, combined. There's value in each of those things. If you've been doing one or the other, it's probably best to stick with that because that's what your baseline data is going. But if this is a new practice for you, I would start out with the whole blade and the petiole attached as your moving forward method. Several of the ag retailers that service this area can help provide that service for you. I also can provide that service for you and help you with the interpretations. Now there's another kind of approach to tissue analysis that maybe you've heard of. Has anybody here implemented sap analysis on their farm or heard of that? Are you using it or heard of it?
Yeah.
Which?
Both.
Both? Okay, good. So sap analysis tells us a slightly different piece of information. That helps us to get a handle, more so like drawing blood from our arm. We're going to see what's actually in that sap in terms of nutrient availability. And it is also a really strong indicator of other pest management implications. Sometimes when we have abnormally high nitrates in the plant, or we have some other antagonism going, it can tell you things that maybe you didn't realize were taking place in your vineyard. And it can help guide you either to avoid those practices or rectify those practices. Whereas our traditional tissue analysis isn't quite that in depth, right? That is more surface level, and that is more to validate what our prescription originally was, right? We started out this season with a plan to apply nutrients at this, and this time. We put out compost. We've buried our horns. We've got everything going. We're using our, whatever, our foliar sprays. Now we're going to check up and see, is what we had planned to do and what we've been doing what we hoped it would do? Are we having problems? Is there a specific issue that we're having? If you have a block that starts to kind of peter out and kind of fall apart on you a little bit, that's a good time to go grab a tissue analysis, but I would probably grab a sap analysis because there's much more in depth. It's a much more costly test, and we would test both new and old tissue on that. So each block would have 2 representative samples for that, so that we can take a look at what our new tissue, which is our sink, and our old tissue, which is our storage. And both of those things together, we would analyze those, helping us to arrive at, perhaps some decisions to be made in moving forward. Maybe there's something glaring there that we can't see with our eyes, right? We just need a different piece of information to help enlighten us on how that's going to work for our farm.
Please.
So for
Well, I mean, our shoots are now,
long, yep.
yeah,
So I would
7 feet.
you would want to take a look at where your fruit is. So your leaf decision would be in relation to your fruit,
Okay.
not necessarily to your position from the primordial. So I would look at a young leaf that's fully open and not crinkly.
Okay.
So that would be maybe 3 to 4 down from our tip, because right now, as we're a ways away from veraison still, we have an opportunity to change its destiny still. Once we start coloring berries, function in these completely shifts.
Sure.
And it works like a switch on a railroad track, right? We go from allowing the train to go this way to now everything goes this way. So we have an opportunity to do that. Your older leaves are going to be, 3 or 4 from your cluster. That's what I would look for.
Within 3 or 4 of the cluster.
Mhm.
Sure. Okay, very good.
So you're going to get a good fully mature leaf and a good young leaf that's mature enough to be able to give us some information.
Okay, how
Right.
about the-
What you're saying.
Yep. So we'll have a young bag and a mature bag on that cab front block that we're going to send for analysis. So then we can then compare those. And
This is sap analysis.
that's sap, correct?
And how many samples do we need of that?
So the sap analysis, you're going to need at least 50 per
50?
bag.
Okay, and how about the cooling requirement and the packaging requirement?
I use a lab here in Michigan, so I don't have to ship it overseas. New Age Labs, Scott Wall in South Haven, Michigan is a wonderful resource. Jenny Garley, she's actually located in California, but she does all the vineyard recommendations and analysis. So after the data has been processed, then that goes through her.
Oh.
And she's a wonderful resource. Jenny Garley is her name. And if you're on social media, you're welcome to check her out. She's very active on LinkedIn and a wealth of information.
That's valuable.
Repeat the question.
So the question was, what do I consider the most important times to take the SAP analysis? I will say for both SAP and tissue analysis, both of these have 2 critical timings. Again, at 25% bloom, and then immediately before or at veraison. At your first signs of veraison, as we're starting to see berries coloring, I'd like to see you out there doing that analysis right then, because we will be applying, we'll have several opportunities over the next 2 weeks, typically, because it's Michigan and we fight the disease pressures that we do, and we have the soils that we do. We're out there spraying quite a bit at that time of the year. So we have opportunities to apply something that may be lacking or confirm the plan that we had played and stay the course with confidence. So that tissue or sap analysis is going to come at the bloom time or veraison time, preferably both, right? So it's not a huge cost. Yes, it feels like it's a lot in a single test, but you may be saving yourself several hundreds or even thousands of dollars in nutrients that you don't need to apply, or in a gaping gap that we have that's going to cost you yield and potentially quality and potentially detriment to the vine going forward. So I think as we try to be more and more cognizant of the environmental impact of over fertilizing our vines, we have kind of this pendulum kind of swings to this almost minimalist approach that can sometimes become too little. right? And then our vines start to struggle, or you know, we also want to look really closely, and I think tissue is a great way to do this, at our blocks that maybe have had improper pruning, or as we're establishing whatever, if we're going to be cane pruning or whatever, that process, that couple of years it takes to build that plant architecture costs the plant a tremendous amount of resources to do what you want it to do. And so we want to make sure that we are, while we're asking it to do what we want it to do by our pruning and shoot thinning methods, that we are supplementing it in a way that we don't have this detriment or over application, right? So we want to kind of swing in the middle more with our pendulum on our nutrient side of things. Based on our practices, our cultural practices, we can be costing the plant a lot more than we realize, especially if we are retraining. We've had a couple of years of really brutal frosts that have hit certain pockets harder than others. And so when you have a frost and then 2 weeks later another frost, and then you're not even fruiting that year because that's all gone, sometimes the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, we don't need to do anything this year, there's no fruit hanging anyway. The reality is that plant has just gone through a major surgery. You didn't perform it, your field help didn't perform it, Mother Nature did it. And so when we experience those massive stressors, those things have a very significant impact on the longevity and the resiliency of these vines to respond to our pruning and our shoot thinning techniques. So I think it's really valid to, especially blocks that have been under stress. We've had the frost, the black cloud of frost looming over us for a while now. And now this year, yes, I'm going to use the D word, the drought word. We are significantly behind, although we've got some rains that have come to us more recently. We went so long without rains, we are still dramatically behind. And these vines have experienced dramatic drought unless you have in-field soil moisture capacitance monitors. You have no idea how deeply this drought is affecting these plants. Although, yes, they have beautiful deep roots. They probably are touching Lake Michigan. They're so beautiful. This soil up here allows the root structures to penetrate beautifully. However, if there's no water, there's no water. So we need to recognize that this growing season, frost wasn't our public enemy number one, it's drought. And that drought causes the plant to do, pull things in tight, right? The way we do in the cold. When we're out in the cold, we want to keep our arms in and keep our torsos warm and protect ourselves. So the plant will do that with its resources as well. It just doesn't look like this necessarily, but that's what it's doing. It's taking inventory of what resources it has, deciding how much energy it can put towards fruit while we're fruiting, while we're developing during inflorescence. We're experiencing a dramatic drought. So that pressure during that particular season may have a very radical effect, not just on your fruit this year, because the plant has already allocated resources into its budget to fill fruit for you. What's left for after that fruit is gone and that plant starts to produce carbohydrates and starts to push it back down in the root system, it will be at a deficit. It's still going to be hungry. So this year, our plans are going to maybe involve a little bit more aggressive post-harvest energy put back into those plants. Just some things to think about with the different types of pressures that we're currently experiencing. Again, tissue analysis can help give us an idea if we've got a block that looks good, our fruit looks good, but it may be still dramatically under budget for water. I just looked at the EnviroWeather yesterday for this location, and we are still dramatically behind. But look at the grapes. They don't look terrible. They're kind of hanging in there. The corn on the peninsula looks worse than the grape, the trees do. What I'll tell you is I'm still a work in progress, right? There's nothing that I can bring to you that's going to be some kind of silver bullet on the water side of things, because it has to do with your water infiltration rate. How fast does your water percolate through the soil profile? How much time does it take for that watering to go through the plant to absorb, get dry again, and then be rewatered? So if you have an irrigation approach that is just to keep it wet, we may be looking at some other pathogen issues introduced into the system that we don't necessarily want. So there's a fine line, kind of this like this delta where we've got enough water, now we have excessive water, and then what happens from there is, you know, we end up with things like powdery and downy and all the other things we don't necessarily want. So when do you stop watering? We're kind of reaching we're getting close to a point where you might be able to back down the water, so that these plants continue to grow new apical meristems underneath. We want new root tissue to keep exploring and seeking new water. And if we're giving it all from the top or too much, we can cause the plant to say, well, I guess I don't need to put resources there. I'm getting it all from above. So there may be some value in letting it get dry before you go back and water again. Get yourself a soil monitor, soil moisture probe. You could order it off Amazon. They're, you know, anywhere from 12 to 18 inches, and it just slides right into the ground, and you can check to see what kind of moisture levels are down there, and let that sort of be a guide for you. It's very simple, rudimentary data that you can collect, and you can get the tools accessible to you to have that information, because the risk of overwatering, now depending on your soil structure again, right? I hate to use that, but that's like the agronomist's famous term. It depends. Sorry. But if you need to figure out what the balance is for those particular fields. So also, cultivars can differentiate in their water demand. So maybe get back to or reach out to wherever you sourced your cultivars from, your plant material from, and see what information you can find on their irrigation sweet spot. That information may be available to you, and that may help bring some context to your particular farm. Because what we're Yep, absolutely. That parent material, that plant material is going to help us to understand what it wants in the first place. So I would use that as kind of my gauge, and then go get you a very cost-effective soil moisture probe, and don't be nervous.
This gadget that I'm gonna buy from Amazon, it's gonna tell me what my soil moisture is.
Yes, it'll tell you the information you need to just seriously.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it tells you that your moisture level is this.
Yes.
But what does that mean? Okay, so what do I do with that?
It never works, we say.
What's that? Okay, so you can actually get a little higher tech version of that. Yeah, the soil moisture capacitance monitor. It's a little bit more techy, and it has a little bit more information. And it goes quite a bit deeper into the soil. But that's where you can use your enviro weather tools that Michigan State Extension has developed to help understand, do we even need to water right now based on our solar radiation, based on, you know, what kind of other impacts we might be looking at, and kind of gauge us and guide us through that process. Because yes, the drought is huge, but overwatering has pretty significant implications for next year and into the future. What it does to, it tells the plant it doesn't need to do. So yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. There's basic information that we can collect ourselves. There's the next level information we collect ourselves, and or utilize professional services to help us interpret, right? So the question here was, if we get a simple, you know, soil moisture meter of some sort, what do we do with that information? Get in touch with a professional. We can help guide you and create a plan that has context. Context for your particular farm is everything. And even your particular cultivars is everything, right? You have to treat every single cultivar you're growing as its own. So, you know, we can help you kind of understand through that. It's a little bit more complicated than just a linear, you know, equation here. But we can get you through that. And either SMAIL, we have a lot of resources in understanding soil moisture and its implications. And the extension group has really got the academic resources behind them to be able to answer those questions.
Christie, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi,
I can
Christie.
hear you. Hi.
Question for you. This is Dave. With coming off of 2 water stress years, last year being drought like this year, what should we be looking for to change or be looking at for fall during the late fall root flush or early spring, as far as knowing that these plants have been in waterless situations, right? Because I think so often people look at early spring and they don't start watering soon enough, or they don't have water available in the fall as well. So can you just speak to kind of post-harvest, pre-bud break thoughts on soil and what we should be looking for?
So there's a couple of, thank you, Dave, for that question. There's a couple of considerations that come to mind with our fall preparations. For example, if we go through a very stressful year, last year being drought, this year being drought, we've had a few years of frost, just different things are going to naturally come at us. Environmental stresses on the plant has its own defense mechanism. It comes pre-programmed to be able to manage stresses just like our human bodies do. However, when we experience prolonged stress like that, what happens is we start to build up inflammation, and that long-term inflammation can have big impacts on the plant's ability to, as I mentioned earlier, to store carbohydrates back down into the root structures, to go to sleep like it's supposed to in the fall. So some things to consider, maybe a little bit of nutrient application or compost application in the fall to help support biological activity. Another consideration that compost could potentially alleviate in a fall or early spring application would be to help mitigate some of the soil microbial detriment also that's taken place because of the environmental stress. When we go through drought and we eradicate the water in our soil structures, our plants can't get to it, we're not getting natural rainfall, we don't have irrigation, our soil microbes have a tremendous impact upon them as well. They require soil solution, moisture in the soil, to perform their normal functioning as planned. So the mycorrhizae fungi, the myriad of bacterias, the protozoas, all the things that naturally live in our soil have been impacted by that. Why that's significant and why you should care, you're a grape farmer, why do I care about microbes? Microbes really truly do all the heavy lifting for everything. So if we can help develop some recovery for our arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi, for example, when they set up camp and start to establish, they set up these webs and networks of additional holding locations for water. They work like extra hands for the soil. So even if we have sandier soil textures that don't naturally want to hold water anyway, that's great if we live in a heavy rainfall season. But when we live in a no rainfall season like we're having currently, or the angry rains, as I like to call them, we don't get rain for 6 weeks, then we get 4 inches in 2 hours, then we don't get rain again for some time. Angry rains are equally unhelpful, marginally helpful, but mostly unhelpful. So what we may want to consider is doing some soil health amending in the fall or in the spring to help support, our soils to recover. That will in turn help to signal to the plants that, hey, we're getting better and we're going to help you get better too. Yes.
Light disking of the row metals, would that be helpful at all for the microbe?
It would help some of the microbial populations, but the ones that signal or that are symptomatic of soil health indicators, they don't like soil disturbance. Unless we're dealing with very compacted soils because of ponding and standing water, I don't really like a lot of tillage. Some light soil disturbance may be helpful. It may also be something where, potentially planting a cover crop that could establish itself and not be a sink on nutrients and water for our plants, but it could help to recover soil microbes in the row where our deep roots are intersecting each other, may be helpful as well. Dave, I hope that answered your question. Did you have some other direction in mind or a follow-up to that?
If you can talk a little bit more about the fungal aspects and all the microbial life in soils, what have you been seeing up here and what are you both excited about and or nervous about in our sandy loam limestone soils?
Something that's new for this area, that I'm really excited about is the introduction of the Haney soil health assessment testing. Has anybody here heard of Haney testing? So Haney tests, along with a suite of soil health indicator tests, are basically establishing a baseline of soil quality and soil health. So we're looking at, through a series of extractions done at a lab in Nebraska, basically what they're doing is looking at what is plant available and microbially available. We're also looking at signatures of different microbes and the balance of those. And why that is even significant, or why that should be on your radar, is because certain cultural practices, particularly fertilizing and pest management applications, can greatly affect those populations of various soil microbes, whom are completely solely responsible for nutrient cycling in the soil. So that's very significant, in my opinion, when we're talking about, I'm going to go and spend the money to apply nutrients to my farm, and I am applying something that could potentially be damaging my soil microbes, or delaying the release of those nutrients that I've applied because I don't have the microbial resources to cycle it through. So that gives us a really great baseline. We can do the basic soil testing in tandem with that. So you can overlay those two factors, both the traditional soil tests with like strong gray acid extraction or malic acid extractions, or you could use the Haney method, or do them both and compare them to understand if I have a fungally dominated vineyard, that means I have some really good, strong soil resiliency characteristics. Maybe you're using a cover crop blend to nurse the plants as a secondary nutrient application. So as they're cycling nutrients, they're releasing more, or as they're decaying, they're releasing nutrients to your vines. I'm not sure if anybody's on that soil health spectrum or utilizing cover crops there, but that's a really good indicator if your cover crop system and plan is working. So no different than what we were talking about, the tissue analysis. It becomes a checkup for what our plans are, our primary plans were for that, and if it's working and if it's having an effect. So then when you come back and sample again in the following season, you can understand if we've moved the needle, if we've improved water infiltration, if we have increased our soil carbon content in its 3 phases. We think a little bit, we overthink the carbon conversation. We don't talk enough about carbon being the currency of the soil microbes. It's literally how they transact business in our soils. It's literally how they transact business with our plants. And so if we can recognize that as much as we want to do to our plants, it's also having a secondary and tertiary effect on the soil microbes as well. Everything we do to this plant is getting utilized and put it back into the soil in some way, shape, or form and having an impact. The soil health analyses is helping us to understand what that impact is or what our baseline is. So if we make changes, maybe we can expect some changes or some growth or some more carbon sequestration, some more currency available for our microbes to utilize. So when we do give it nutrients, it can release it more effectively. Any questions on like a soil health side of things? That's another big topic. So
Where do you get these handling tests?
the Haney test is, it's a soil sampling. The Haney test is a testing methodology at the lab. I use Soil Regen Ag Lab in Nebraska for that. They process the Haney test. They do the H3A extraction, which is another extraction for additional information on micronutrients, macronutrients, water, extractable carbon, phos, potassium. Water extractable meaning immediately available to the microbes. So
Repeat the name of the lab in Nebraska.
I use Soil Regen Ag Lab.
So again, would we go through you for this?
I can connect you with that. Absolutely. But there is, you do need to work with an agronomist that understands how to interpret that so that you can get good usable information, right? You could ship your stuff off to that, and Lance owns a lab we'll ship it back and say, Christie, these folks are in Michigan, get a hold of them and help them out. Because they're far enough away that they can't individually, coach you through that. And what you would do with that information is then look at things like, what kind of cover crop could we plant here that would make a difference? How is that going to affect our overall nutrient plan? Am I going to use compost in the fall or in the spring or at all? There may be a case to be made that'll help you maybe eliminate some products that aren't achieving the goals that you want or are having a negative effect that it sorts itself out through the course of the year, but basically those become wasted resources. So if we can eliminate waste and improve your efficiency through something like that, that will help you to put your money where it's going to make you the most money back, right? In whatever classification of success you're looking for, whether it be specific quality or yield or whatever that may be. That would probably help.
Yes. I don't know how I would do that.
Okay, so if in case the folks at home didn't hear, the question was, my soil sample came back with sufficient amount of nutrients to supply what I need, like I shouldn't even have to apply much of anything. But my petiole is telling me that I'm essentially deficient. So what I would suggest, there may be something to capturing both parts, this as one whole part. So you get both organs together, because it may the sample that you sent in may have not had a lot of sap in this organ. There isn't a lot of actual tissue here to actually test unless we're using the sap out of it. However, when you have the solar panel along with the supply chain, the straw, you're getting a very different picture, right? So there may be some value for you to try a blade sample this year at Veraison to see if it gives you different information, okay? It may be possible that you have a unicorn field and you may not need to apply any nutrients whatsoever. Your fertilizer guy is not going to like that. So I'm just saying, I sell crop nutrients also. That's how I've made a living for a long time. So I understand, but having, sometimes it takes a different look at maybe a different plant part or this whole plant part to give you some new information. And the uptake, your gut instinct is already telling you that you have an uptake problem. We can validate that by getting a whole leaf sample. And what you can do with that maybe also is partner that with a soil health assessment. Maybe you have a microbial deficiency, not a nutrient deficiency. The microbial deficiency is impeding the uptake. The business transacted between your soil microbial populations and your plant is out of balance. And so the plant may be signaling for something that the soil microbes either don't have the resources to do it, and in which case, maybe it isn't a NPK problem, maybe it's a carbon problem. And so there's other things we can do to support carbon and labile carbon so that the plants can have a little bit of resources to do that. So I think there's a really interesting story developing here for you to learn something really cool. And I'd be curious to see what it actually looks like. I am a big fan of foliar applying micronutrients for a few reasons. Number one, they need very small quantities of those things, and our soil structures are not conducive to supplying them. Boron runs from sand. And when it is applied to the soil, it leaches away faster than sulfates and nitrates. So your boron soil samples, I could almost promise you, if you farm in this region, you have very, very low boron levels. It's because the soil can't hold it. It repels. It moves in the soil solution very rapidly. So boron is essential for that plant to thrive. It's very instrumental in the processing of reproductive cells. So there's a couple periods of time through the course of the growing season where the plant has a significant boron hunger, and we're growing in soils that don't traditionally supply well. And so the plant does with what it can do. But if we supply a small amount of boron in different forms, the plant can take in boron in a couple different forms. We can actually improve, supplying that ahead of its need, the same way a runner would have a nice carb heavy meal 24 hours before a marathon. What we're doing is we're supplying something before the sink happens so that there's a reserve there to carry it through when it's utilizing that particular nutrient. Zinc and Mn have almost the exact opposite problem. They're not really subject to leaching the same way that boron would be. They're highly subject to tie up. Now, we don't necessarily have a lot of soil structure in this area that would indicate tie up is a huge issue. But for those of us that do have more clay content, we're much more susceptible to tie up. And so another way to kind of circumvent that process is to supply small amounts of Mn and zinc at specific timings when it needs it. So it allows us to kind of fine tune our nutrient program to say, okay, we know this, and this is well documented. Academia has done a really good job of helping us to understand at what periods of time these hungers are greatest. And so if we can supply it in anticipation of that hunger peak, we can avoid hidden hunger deficiencies. The plant may never give us leaf tissue symptoms of a Mn deficiency, but it may still have it, right? Our human body is capable of that as well. We can literally live off of carbs alone for a long time, but we're not healthy. But we're functioning, but we're not healthy. Same thing, we can't live on protein alone. We've got to have fats and we have to have carbs. It's an essential nutrient, not a suggested nutrient for production, okay? So these are, I like the idea of foliar feeding micronutrients because I don't want to apply something that my soils can't handle or aren't going to do the right thing with. I don't need boron leaching through the soil profile. I don't want anything leaching through the soil profile if I can avoid it. And same thing with tie up. When we tie up, what we're doing is we cause the soil physics to be affected. And then that causes other things to happen in the soil that aren't necessarily great. Eventually compaction and ponding and other problems that we have in a permanent cropping system. So I do advocate for that. And if you're in an organic system or if you're in a regenerative system or a biodynamic system, it's very easy to achieve, to access those types of nutrients through things like compost, compost teas, and other indigenous microorganism fermentations. So those can be achieved even in more restrictive growing environments. In our traditional commercial environments, those kind of nutrients are easily accessed. Also, one caveat to foliar feeding, just because you paid money for it, because it got delivered to the farm and you applied it, does not mean it got into the plant. So don't be fooled by that as well. This is where tissue sampling, again, helps us to validate what our plan was and if we're on target with that, okay? And it's not that the fertilizer doesn't work. It may have not been applied at the right time or in the right quantity, or it may need to add something to the mix to help the plants to pull it in through the plant stomate. When we're applying foliar application, we're applying something to the leaf tissue. We want the leaf to open its mouths, all of its little teeny tiny mouths, and take a big drink of what we just gave it. So if we apply our nutrients in a delivery system that is has a seaweed extract, for example, is a super cost-effective way to improve our uptake of not only fungicides and insecticides or other systemic pesticides we may need, but also nutrients. Particularly things like boron is kind of a big clunky molecule and it doesn't like to enter through the plant tissue very well unless we utilize something like a good quality seaweed extract to get us there.
That means something like a sea cow.
I'm not sure that if a product has the term sea in it, that it actually has any amount of seaweed in it. But I would have to do a label look at that, and I'd be happy to give you my opinion on that. My experience has been over the course of my years, 15 years of working with crop nutrients, that there is a lot of difference in seaweed extracts, humic acids, and fulvic acids. There's a wide range. I'll use an example. Maybe you can understand what I'm saying here. If a package of bologna says it's 98% fat-free, does that mean it's healthy? And yet people still buy it because it's healthy. Bingo! It still says bologna. Now, I'm not above eating a bologna sandwich. I grew up on it, okay? I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. Okay, there's an art to bologna, let's just say, okay? So just don't get sucked into the marketing and the packaging of things. Do some label research and do a little bit of due diligence on that. I'm very happy to, if you want to email me, I'll give you my contact info. If you want to run some products by me, I'd be happy to give you my opinion. And maybe even help you find a source for it too. Because sometimes that's an issue. We only have these guys that we can get stuff from. Well, maybe we can get something, we just didn't know who to ask. And I'm happy to help you with that. I'm very well connected to the ag retails, not just in this area, but throughout the Great Lakes and in other geographies that are wine growing regions. So I'm happy to be a resource for you guys in that. Okay. Regenerative and organic production have become more mainstream in our vernacular. It was long thought a harebrained hippie idea to utilize something like that. However, seaweed has some very specific properties in it, and depending on what species of seaweed and where it comes from has a tremendous impact on how effective it is. So there's specific hormones that are naturally occurring in different species of seaweeds that help it to resist stress. It helps it to mitigate inflammation. It helps it to reduce cellular oxidation. It helps to regulate pressure, water pressure in cell structures. It also helps to open and close stomates on the plant leaf tissue. So depending on what we need to do with it, there may be different seaweed extract products that could potentially have a different effect for your farm. One size doesn't necessarily fit all. And although seaweed in general can have a lot of really great properties, we may also not need it at all. So a discerning eye and some due diligence could help you develop a plan that maybe finding a spot for something like that, or that specifically to fit into what you're currently. The comment was, is it safe to say that it couldn't hurt, but it will cost money? I think that's accurate. But if it costs you money and it provides you with better uptake of a fungicide or maybe some rapid uptake of a nutrient, yes, it may cost you money, but what are we gaining in it? So when I deposit into my retirement, I have to trust that I have a plan and then I have to validate. Trust, but validate, right? Is what we're trying to do. And that goes right back to what we were discussing here tonight anyway. So awesome questions, awesome discussion. Thank you guys.